Constructive Criticism is sponsored by Oasis Games. MTGOasis.com is the place to get cards for your next Magic event. Try them out with code CCMTG for 15% off of your first order, and use the code WouldThatBeGood for 4% off of every order. Want to support the show directly? Head on over to patreon.com/CCMTG to check out some awesome benefits and future goals for the show. Thanks for listening, and here's this week's episode of Constructed Criticism. Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructed Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructedCriticism.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 409th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your manga-loving host, Mason, but I'm joined by two anime lovers with Spy Family from Abe and Fire Force Dispenser. Abe, we were just talking about Spy X Family before we started here. Notice how I used both. That way I'm covered from the weebs. They can't get me no matter what. That's just so good, right? Like, if someone's looking for a show to watch, it's the thing they gotta pick up.
Best thing of the season right now, I think. Like, it's really, really
Spencer, have you seen Spy Family?
Heard good things. I do know that Fire Force is still supposed to somehow come out this year, which is mind-boggling, because it wasn't renewed until March, and I don't think the manga's finished, and this is the last season, because it will end with the manga.
That two-part final season life, Spencer.
Yeah, you're going to have an Attack on Titan situation where it's 2024 when you finally see it.
Oh, man.
Oh, my goodness gracious. Well, you know, manga's great, and it's important to pick out good manga and anime to watch. But what's more important than that, of course, is picking your deck for a tournament. And that's really what we're going to be covering today. But first, we do need to be doing Always Improving, and this is the main point of the show. I will lead things off this week. My Always Improving moment comes from actually picking a deck and looking into stuff. So, you know, if you've been around Magic recently, Ledger Shredder is the talk of the town. You can't get away from it. It's kind of the card. People are playing it in every format now. It's all over the place. And I've seen it in some different spots, and I've seen some stuff with Ledger Shredder. I was like, oh, this is cool. And I really think this card is good at being grease for a deck and making the deck function. But I don't think it's enough to like make a deck into a deck that wasn't before. And when I was thinking about it, I was like, well, I really like this Grease Fang stuff, but I want to play it more tempo combo-y. So it's kind of like almost inverter-esque, where I can play like an interactive game, or I can like combo you on turn 3. And that's what I kind of built, and I've been playing it in Pioneer, and it's like good, but not great. But it was cool to kind of like try to approach like, how do I solve this problem, build a deck towards that, and just do that sort of thing. And that was my improving moment, was going back into a well of a strategy I've written off, because I do not think the Grease Fang deck currently in like a Mardu showing like that is actually good. And I kind of written off the Esper before, but this card was enough to get me reinterested in the archetype. And I think there is something to the Esper for what it's worth, so not writing something off.
I definitely think that when it comes to Ledger Shredder, because it's a card that has been kind of a hit from the set that we haven't talked about much, if you're out there thinking, how do I make them Ledges shred? Make sure you're a proactive deck that wants to be casting spells on their turn. That's like the best thing about the card, is that when you can cast it and another thing in the same turn, get the immediate trigger. Decks with Thoughtseize especially super good for that. So I'm not surprised that the Esper deck. You playing Tainted Indulgence in that? Or are you more of a Faithful Mending kind of?
So I have both. And I want to cut a little bit. I tried putting 4 and 4 of each on my first league. And I think I want to play 4 Mending, 3 Indulgence, because it's really hard for me to get Indulgence to not just be Mending without flashback, even though it's a little easier on my mana. Actually, just having so much of that allows me to like move through and find the right stuff. And I totally agree, by the way. Like Ledger Shredder, when you can like function off like 4-ish lands and you just are double spelling all the time and never having extra lands laying around, or like turning these situational spells into power so you can actually clock them quicker. Card's just great. It's really strong. Abe, how have you always improved this week?
So this week was kind of a test. With the Arena Open this weekend that was sealed, I wound up telling myself I'd only play like one bullet. I didn't really have much time on Saturday or Sunday, but I did want to play because I have put a lot of time in a limited format, and I do enjoy it a decent bit. Especially sealed is just always a fun puzzle. And I have also, as I talked about last week, kind of focused a little bit more on my technical play, making sure that I'm making the best plays I can, playing around all the things I can. I've been playing a lot of Slay the Spire to accommodate that, really focusing, as that game gets more and more difficult, for people who are familiar with it as like an ascension system where the game gets harder and harder. You kind of replay it as this deck building game. So there's this aspect of, really pushing yourself as things get harder to be making all of the correct decisions, not only in the way that you're crafting your deck with these cards that you can get access to, but also with the way you're sequencing all of your cards when you're doing a fight or whatever. So doing a lot of that because it was really enjoyable and also felt like really good practice for making sure I was sequencing everything properly and thinking everything through. In Magic, and on day one of the Arena Open, I had a match where I was like 4-0 at the time, and I just didn't play my fourth land before combat, where I knew I was going to cast a combat trick that was going to like swing the game in my favor, close the door on things, and my opponent played the only thing that punishes me, which was make disappear, copied, and I was just really frustrated by it. But I wound up going 6-3 on that run. I was like, man, if I'd actually taken the time like I told myself I would have absolutely crushed. My deck was not very good, but I was making it work with just good deck building, understanding what the format was about, did all these things right and this one thing wrong. So I fired another bullet and wound up making day 2 with that one, where I had a very similar situation where there were some amount of counter spells and various combat tricks I was able to suss out and actually devote myself to playing around and invalidating for my opponent rather than enabling them the way that I did to lose that other match. And it just felt good to see that kind of continued return on spending this time focusing on the little things.
I like it when all the little stuff adds up and pays off. It's the tedious part of Magic, but it's so important.
Yeah, scrapping for it all is always really good. How about you, Spencer?
Mine is non-Magic related, but Magic related. It came from a decision that I made last week to kind of, finally pull the trigger and starting to get things changed for my health. I found out that I have some high cholesterol problems, and I'm trying to make some adjustments in my life. And so part of that is behind me, I typically have a bar full of alcohol. The only thing on this bar now is a tapped jug of water. I also started going back to my counting macros and playing Ring Fit Adventure on my Switch downstairs. Part of the things that I've been trying to work on a lot over the last year have been my mental health. And I think that, the closer I get to having that under control, the more that I'm going to need my physical health to catch up. Because eventually, my physical health will drag down my mental health. And so, got to play some Ring Fit yesterday. I plan on playing more Ring Fit tomorrow, as well as just kind of changing my diet. And it's been good. I'm only on, day 3 really of some of these changes, but even just developing small little habits for long-term success is really important. There was a podcast that I was listening to that talked about this person who didn't even go into the gym. She just drove to the gym every day for a week before she signed up to develop the habit of just driving to the gym. So, I decided I'm just going to track my food. Even if I don't meet my macro goals, I'm just going to track it anyway. And it's been good. So
Forming good habits is really powerful. It's kind of a sick story about just, she was like, yeah, I probably won't be able to do this if I don't make it a habit already. So I just got to drive to the gym beforehand. Kind of cool.
Getting that first step and getting your feet wet into a new goal like that, especially when it comes to a big change, easing yourself into it's really important. I'm glad that's something that you're doing, Spencer.
You can support the show by going to patreon.com/ccmtg. You get some perks to that, get a Patreon question, which we do at the end of the show. But you also get a Patreon shout out at the start of the show, like our boy Kyle Reichert, who signed up. Thank you so much, Kyle. Nice to have you in the Patreon Discord. And hopefully you do pretty well at the energy this weekend. But we also need to do some housekeeping. We have some pretty big announcements. And Spencer, do you want to take this by the reins?
I'm kind of sad about this one, but I think that it is the right time. We are going to be mutually ending our relationship with Oasis Games at the end of May. And as part of that, we will not be running the 1K anymore. We will still be running quarterly events. We have a new sponsor yet to be announced that will be sponsoring those, but we won't be working with Oasis after this month. And because of that, it didn't make sense to give out a bunch of store credit to a place that we weren't going to be in a business relationship with anymore. I still love Oasis. It's still one of my favorite places. I certainly hope there's no hard feelings on Oasis' side. I know there's no hard feelings on my side. I got to speak to the owner last week. and we had a real heart-to-heart, and I felt like this was the right time, and he agreed, and we're going to part ways. But I just can't believe that, we had a sponsor. It'll be 400, and it might literally be 400 episodes by the time that that relationship ends, and something that not a lot of podcasts experience. I can't think of a podcast in Magic that had a single sponsor for that long. I love them and I appreciate them. To the patrons who are patrons of $10 or more, reach out to me. We'll figure something out. We already have kind of talked to Mason and I already talked a little bit about like some ideas, but we definitely want to still do something for those people. It just won't be that 1K. So stay tuned for the new sponsor, the announcement of the next event, things like that.
We'll get more into that as we get to that. But we need to get into our main topic today, and that's picking your RCQ deck. This topic is for all things when it comes to Magic, and we're going to touch on stuff that's more than just RCQs. But there is something a little bit different about picking a deck, for a qualifier event that's a lot smaller than maybe something like an SCG or a Grand Prix. And it's something that is kind of, I feel like, not talked about enough. Abe, do you feel similarly where people kind of feel like it's just 1-to-1?
Especially as the last few years, Magic has become more and more digital. People kind of view things really as like, oh, there's just one correct answer, without considering the problem in front of them when it comes to the metagame they're walking into, what they're going to play against, what they need to worry about. And so it can be really important. There's a big edge to be gained always in deck building, but especially for deck building for the metagame you're expecting more than just the metagame that exists on Magic Online or that people talk about.
Spencer, when we talk about this and we talk about like what's different, what's that, what can you give like an example to the listener of like why something might be better at like, let's say, a 40-person tournament compared to a 4,000-person tournament?
Can I pitch in on the last question though? Because
oh yeah, for sure.
One of the things that can be thought about, Abe actually brought up something that I had not thought about that has changed in Magic, that might start changing back for what it's worth. We went from this area where like 5-0ing a league was pretty hard on MTGO for a long time, right? Like not like super difficult, like we all did it, but like congrats on the 5-0, right? A lot of people just assumed that anybody in ladder stopped mattering, but also that the decks in ladder were important. It was a really weird dichotomy of opinions about this thing. I don't think that like a ladder deck equated to a good SCG online deck or a good any of those online series that happened all the time, right? In fact, we actually saw that happen, right? When there were those SCG events, the ladder did actually not reflect what did well, even though those were only like 40 to 100 people events, right? While this topic won't apply just to RCQs, I think that it kind of applies to like that qualifier GPT PTQ 1K size event. That is different. And to go into the question that you were asking, Mason, which is like what makes a deck stronger or weaker in these situations, I think it's because you're able to tackle different problems in those spaces. There's this really cool guy, his name is Shmation Schmark. He talks about no bad decks. I mean, Mason, you've heard from that guy before. Like, how does he say it?
Only reasonable decks.
Only reasonable decks. And one of the things that I think that ends up happening a lot is somebody will see that some deck in wherever, I don't want to insult somebody's hometown, won a PTQ. Salt Lake City, Utah, West Valley, Utah, team or mid-range by this dork wins the event, right? And so...
Big Nucks.
Yeah, Big Nucks. And so people just assume they either discredit that event or then they overvalue this thing, right? And I think that the things that make a deck strong in a 40 to like 150, 200 person event, or maybe not that big. I think that the space of PTQs you're all coming for the same reason, right? So at RCQ, right, you're all coming to try and go to the regional championship. That is not the reason everybody shows up to an SCG. That is not the reason everybody shows up to a Grand Prix. And also, you don't have this day 1, day 2 winner metagame split. And there's like some real differences between 6 to 7 or 8 rounds in a top 8 to 14 rounds plus top 8. They're just different things. And the type of decks that are good in those situations can vary. Like, I think glass cannon decks are a really good example of something that actually can be really good in like a 6 round plus top 8 event or things like that. Whereas I personally don't think that they're as good in something like a You know, a GP.
When you have less rounds, your like sample size is much smaller. So it kind of goes back to like the button clicking thing we talked about last week on the show, where I was like, hey, if I recommend you a deck, it's like you're going to play that deck like, I expect 100 times or whatever. And if that's the case, I want to give you a deck that's reasonable 100 times. I don't want to give you something that's like a metagame deck for a weekend. Those decks sometimes still do well, despite, all the odds or whatever, and there's like a bunch of factors there. But like if you play, let's say 14 rounds, right? And then, you play top 8 or whatever, that's 17 rounds of Magic for winning a tournament versus like you play a local RCQ, it's 6 rounds and 3 rounds for top 8, right? The difference between making top 8 of that RCQ is the same as qualifying for day 2 of that Grand Prix. And how many people do you know have had like a great day 1 of a Grand Prix and then bombed day 2? Or how many decks have seen on the like back when they did coverage where it was like, oh, and we've got the Sliver Human Wizard Tribal deck at 8-0 playing for undefeated. And it's like, you didn't hear about them in day 2 because they had to keep playing Magic. But like they can win something like, these RCQs. And that is something to like keep in mind. And also like it informs like deck selection and stuff like that and things you should be worried about.
Willie Adel actually had like a really interesting take on how to pick a deck at one point that I really liked, where he talked about like the first thing that he's going to do for any event he goes to, he's going to make sure his deck can beat aggro decks. What's funny is I think that question, Mark, is actually good for both things, right? But then once you get to the like some of his next steps were really interesting. So one of the things that was not on his list is I have to be able to like beat blue-white control or whatever. Whereas like one of the things that ends up happening at like, at least in my opinion, like PTQ level events or these now regional championship qualifiers, RCQs for what it's worth. And yes, we will call them that on the show. So leave a comment with your hate that we didn't call them PPTQs to drive up our engagement. That'd be helpful. Those events, people bring so many like negates and duresses and like anything that they can do to not lose to the card cancel. And so you need to have that information in your pocket going into your RCQ. You need to know that like, dude, you're going to play against this type of interaction a lot of times.
Abe, I have a question for you. This is something that I think you and I have talked about a little bit in the past, maybe on the show, maybe not, but about the old 15th sideboard card and being something that kind of a pick your poison and you just don't want to lose to something. That's something that I feel like for listeners when it comes to picking an RCQ deck is much more saleable. You're going to play less rounds, right? You're going to see less stuff. And then just like having something that like maybe it's going to pop up that's like a bad matchup or a matchup you don't like, and then having a sideboard card for it to help swing that matchup. Is that something that you kind of like and think about more when you're doing these smaller events?
I think like probably the best example of this I remember, it really depends on where you're picking that and what the reason is, right? Like the story that I always remember when I think about doing this is Dylan Donegan it was either like some local 5K or like an SG Regionals, co-host of the MTG Grindcast, Lee. He always plays wacky artifact decks. And Dylan was playing Grixis Shadow. And he was just like, I took stock Grixis Shadow and I picked the matchups where I can afford to lose points. And I just shoved in some stuff to make sure I could beat a random wacky artifact deck because I know that one of the best players in my area who's going to be at this event is going to be playing that strategy. And it kind of comes into the stuff we talked about on the episode about like building your character sheet for the deck that you're building and the deck you're playing for the event is think about the quote unquote, the monsters, the end bosses, the people you're going to play against. Think about the things that you're worried about people bringing. What is it that you expect the players that you're going to have to beat? Because you have to win these tournaments. The people you're going to have to beat to get first place, and thinking about where it is that you need to allot those points that you have available to yourself, flexibility-wise, to win the event. Like the same reason why I personally shy away from glass cannon strategies in events like that, where first place is the only thing that matters, right? Is because you can make your way into top 8 pretty well. It works 5 times, doesn't work 1 time. Okay, you make it. But then you have to work 3 times in a row, and that's almost as hard as it working like 4 or 5 times out of 6.
That's actually a really good point. Because I was thinking a lot of this is like the type of deck that I would bring to an RCQ is similar to the type of deck that I would play at like a Magic Online challenge. But that might not be true.
I think it really depends on your region a lot. My region's always been really saturated with these kind of events. We have a lot of LGSs that can run these things and do run them pretty well. So my average RCQ is usually 30-ish people. Like a big one is 60-ish, but they're always like 5 or 6 rounds, more like your local 1 or 2K. And for those, knowing what the people who are making the rounds every week and showing up on what they're playing and kind of adapting for them is a much smarter thing to do than being like, oh, well, did you see that Living End won the challenge again? So now I need to have this extra graveyard hate. It's like if no one plays Living End around you, like it's the case when I play my local Modern 1Ks, there's like, I can count on one hand the amount of Living End and 4-color players combined, but it takes me 2 hands to count all of the Hammer Time and Murktide that I play against. So that's why I play Hammer Time all the time locally, right? Is because I know that I'm this much more likely than this to play against the matchups that are good. Knowing what you're coming in against and trying to ascertain that information, that becomes really important in kind of making those decisions. But you have to know, you shouldn't be guessing.
Yeah, we've talked about this. I think Michael Hinderaker was the first one that brought this up on the podcast. At some point, the conclusion that you come to isn't as important as the reason that you have for it. So Abe just gave the literal reason that I'm okay playing a glass cannon, that I would be more okay playing a glass cannon deck at these style of events than at a Grand Prix. But he came to a different conclusion than me. And I think it really good. Like, I also have, I'm going to have 22 RCQs probably in my area. So, to me, if I play the same glass cannon deck at 22 RCQs, the odds are fine. It's whatever. It's funny that we came to different conclusions in similar spaces. And I think that the truth is that the answer we came to wasn't as important as going through the thought exercise.
Deck selection, especially as players, you got to know what's the best thing for you, right? It's like why I wouldn't show up playing, something like Dredge or like Tron every weekend is because I'm afraid of those situations where, I'm sure I make top 8 every time, but then I play against the person who has the extra spreading season, has the Blood Moons, has the hate for my strategy. They brought the extra rest in pieces. They brought the Stony Silences or whatever it is. When I'm trying to, only win the event, that's the thing that really matters to me is it's too easy for that to happen. But conversely, maybe I should be thinking of it as 1 week, these people aren't going to be expecting it. And they're going to be they're not going to have that hate and I'm going to get a free walk through. It's always how you look at it.
So it's funny about all of this because y'all didn't know about this. I haven't talked about it on the show, but my LGS does this thing where they, for 2 months, track everyone's record in Modern, and then the top 16 players when it comes to finishes by match points get invited to an invite-only, win a box of Modern Horizons and win some other stuff tournament. And I'm playing it this Saturday. And because it matters with seeding too to incentivize you to play more, you win more matches, you get a higher play draw. I know who my opponent is in round 1. And in theory, I know what my 1 and 2 opponents will be in round 2, right? Assuming I win or lose, I kind of have all of the information available to me pretty readily. And it's kind of okay, I haven't lost a match of Modern since February playing Money Pile at my store. And everyone knows I play Money Pile every week. And I have access to I have the burn deck right here. I can come in with the burn deck. And I know the guy who I'm playing round 1 plays Murktide. He's very good. I've seen him in a Murktide Discord saying, can I play 4 subtleties in my deck if I know I'm playing 4-color round 1? Right? And it's okay, do I take this sort of risk and do this sort of thing versus the tried and true faithful? And this is kind of a microcosm, hyper extreme example of the RCQ thing and the kind of philosophy that these two are talking about and how different they are, And it comes down to what do you think is best? For me, typically, to weigh in on the RCQ, PPTQ style thing, I try to pick the most reasonable deck that I think I have for the weekend and then play it and make sure that I just have good plans over. And that typically ends up with me playing some sort of mid-ranging strategy, but there have been times where I played aggro decks. I played Bardu Vehicles, one of my first PPTQ playing that, versus a deck like Teamer Energy, which I played most of the time when it was legal. I feel that if I had to choose one, I kind of fall in the camp of Abe, where I'm I know that I can probably make it top 8, and then at that point it's just about kind of what Spencer said too. It's just about playing so many tournaments to make sure that I get my chance to spike it. But I see it almost the same thing, but with reasonable is a bad word to say for this situation, but fair decks, quote unquote, because I always put myself in a position to top 8, and then it's just about winning 3 matches. If that's all I have to do, that's fine. Where if I play the glass cannon deck, maybe I'm supposed to top 8 a majority of the time because I'm the better player, quote unquote, playing the good glass candy deck. But I might run into someone who just Yeah, I hate living end, and I've brought a bunch of chalices, a bunch of meddling mages, and your day is ruined. Have fun, you know? I played humans because I heard the living end matchup's good. And it's like, well, there's me and one other person playing living end, so have fun beating Fury. And like that's a thing that for me is really frustrating, and I find very taxing about those decks if they're not overwhelmingly good.
And that effect is kind of why people like have this this feeling. A lot of players who, especially players who are like, you know, some of the better players in like a region or in a store, they kind of gravitate towards more controlling or mid-rangey decks, right? Decks that are very fair because they feel like they have more of that agency, right? You know, if like I wound up playing a mid-range mirror 3 times in my top 8, then like maybe I could have maneuvered better, I could have played better, because then it's kind of like even footing. Whereas if I play this combo deck, something that's kind of trying to do one specific thing that's more easily targeted, then I'm kind of rolling the dice instead of putting the game in my hands. When really, like, I think it's important to, you know, because there are people of all playstyles that both are really valid approaches. And I know plenty of people who've had tons of success knowing how to do those combo decks really well and like understanding how to play through those things. And like they win more events than me sometimes because they just are willing to take those risks when I'm not.
Spencer, how much do you think risk taking matters in smaller events? And, you know, I want to kind of segue this into how we pick a decks for this event. So if you can like tail into that, I'm very curious, because that is something that I think is a very interesting thing. And you've kind of shown that you're on the other camp to make it extreme. You know what I mean? Even though I don't think we're that different. Well, like you were saying, you were more willing to play a glass cannon deck, and Abe and I were yeah.
Oh yeah. So it's funny because when I talk about glass cannon, I actually am talking about like one of the decks that like Abe mentioned. Like I'm more willing to play like Tron, but like not a deck like I'm not about to bust out like.
Not going to bring out Neoform.
Yeah, I'm not gonna bust out Neoform. That's actually a really good example of a deck that I would literally just never play.
That's what I think of.
So I think of like Winota versus Arclight Phoenix.
But
like that's like in my head, like to use like a modern example.
Oh yeah, I would be much more like I'd be willing to play either of those style of decks. For me, the risk comes down to like the acceptable risk that you're willing to take. I think that the character sheet. First of all, thank you so much for using my magic theory on this podcast. I really appreciated it. But I think it really does come down to like where you're putting your skill points. And like if you are one of the better players in your region, it's funny that we talked about like they start to gravitate towards those mid-range and control decks, right? And I think that's been true about me a lot. I'd actually like to be more aggressively mid-range slanted, and here's the reasons why. Or I might go completely off the rails because I don't think that they're prepared for this thing. It has to come from a place of process rather than a place of just because it's me. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, we talked about how having the reason and going from the reason is important. And I think that once you become one of the better players in your region, it's easier to start to connect the dots and make those type of decisions. Because otherwise you're one of the people in chat said, well, what if you're just guessing? It's like, well, then you're not doing what we're saying. Like if you're just guessing, then you should probably go about. The other thing I think that's key that we're missing in this part is one of the things that's always true at these events is that the best deck is still going to be some percentage of just good. You can just do that. You can just play the best deck. And there's going to be some percentage of players that will do that, and that is okay. What's going to happen, though, is it won't be the percentage that you see on ladder. And understanding both that from a card availability perspective, from the fact that these are humans that aren't just trying to get a badge on a client and that are trying to win an event and are going to make decisions accordingly, means that you have to calculate what your risk is that you're willing to accept. How many times have I registered the card Scapeshift where people were like, it's not good? It's like, you know how many PPTQs I won with Scapeshift? All of them I played. Like, just actually all of them. Even though people know I'm going to be playing Scapeshift, I think that it's the deck that, one, I'm going to pilot the best. I think it's the deck that puts a question on the metagame. Like, I don't think it's easy for them to prepare for me and for somebody else. Same reason I liked Tron for a couple of weeks here in Modern. I was like, I think people have forgotten that Tron exists. I wasn't the only person that had that idea. I think, wasn't it Kenji top-aided with 73 of the 75 that I played in that same challenge? Like, it is about the process. And if you don't have one and you're just guessing, then just guess with a good deck, I guess.
All that Magic is a lot of the time, and a lot of what we talk about on the show, is about just practicing good habits over and over and over and over again so that you are able to do things right and learn and improve and like get to a place eventually. You could argue that if you don't know what is like the best stuff or whatever, and you like look at what you see online and these results and you're like kind of guessing, right? Like you're not sure, but you're like, okay, I think this is it. That is much different than a guess, which is like, yep, I'm infects the deck this week, and that's my guess. Like,
I
that's
think
so
it's
much
going to
more.
be burn. I'm bringing my life game.
I think that there's a difference though between like guessing
Yeah,
and
that's what I'm
educated
saying.
guessing, right? I think that what we're talking about though, Mason, I think at some point it is some amount of guessing. But like, how are you not supposed to have some amount of guessing is my question for you, Mason.
Well, you just can't, right? Like kind of like what Spencer said, people are going to do the best thing they can to win. And since you're quickly mentioning card availability, but like there are just going to be factors that are going to stop people from like doing the thing that's optimal or even the thing they want to do, right? Like they're going to have card availability issues, or like their cards didn't arrive in time, or they couldn't practice or whatever, blah, 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 blah. So there's just always all these things that come up where like they get scared, they don't want to play this deck for whatever reason, People are going to make actions, but you can't predict it, but all you can do is kind of make the most reasonable guess that you can, the most reasonable choice, and not overdo things and be like, well, I saw Living End won the challenge, so I'm going to make sure that I bring in, 3 unlicensed Hearse to my main deck.
Dude, the number of people that thought Matt was playing Living End at the last 1K, they're like, oh, there was only one Living End player and he 0-2 dropped. I was like, are you talking about Matt? Because he was not playing Living End.
Hey, what were you going to say, though, about what Spencer, the question?
I think about, this is something that actually kind of revolutionized my process, was something that it was in a 400 level class I took in college called Introduction to Game Theory. Why it's very, very relevant. That class was a lot about, just looking at logical structures and breaking them down and how things play out, making good strategic decisions based on the information you have. Something that obviously very easily applies to Magic, and especially more than I thought to stuff like this when it comes to metagaming, is that when you have a complicated problem, one with multiple steps to solve, you have to start breaking things down into chunks and looking at what are rationalizable strategies. It's called rationalizable strategies because you look at it and it's the thing that makes the most sense for someone to be doing, and with that, you can establish a belief, which then it gives you the permission to start striking things out that are not going to happen because, in the way that you're constructing this logically, that they won't do this, so now you can do this other thing. And so, when it comes to making a good deck choice in Magic and these events, or, making sure your process makes sense, you should be trying to make sure that your strategies are based on beliefs that are rationalizable, right? Like if my belief is that this weekend, the graveyard decks are the best decks, so I'm going to take it one step further than that and try to get an advantage in this situation by playing more Graveyard Hate or playing a deck that's naturally good against those. When it comes to making sure you have a good process, you should make sure that at the core of it, your belief is something that you believe is true and is something that you can build on, right? Overall, that's the way I think about it, because it was the way that really opened my eyes to it in a way that I could speak it into existence more than I already had internalized it. And I hope that's helpful to you guys. I think it's like really perfect.
I do too. I think that it goes back to the point that we made earlier about Grand Prix and like those SCG events, right? There's gonna be some number of people that are gonna register 5-color slivers, but that's not a reasonable thing for them to do. And once you get to day 2, so it's like the same problem but has different segments. Like you talked about segmenting it, right? I've talked about this on the podcast, obviously, because I think the podcast was going to happen. We had 5 players register a deck for a PTQ. We had a win percentage, I think, of like 85 between the 5 of us. Nobody top 8'd. People are like, how does that happen? And it's like, well, we got random losses that we didn't expect. It's probably the most players that I've ever had people play a deck of mine. Somebody lost them on a White Knights. I lost to like Mardu, Sack and Steel. Like, just these random things happened. And it's like, well, did you make the wrong decision because you didn't win? That's like, no, that's not how that works. And I think too often, the other thing that happens is people get so tied up in being afraid to make the wrong decision for something like a winner-take-all events like an RCQ, that they aren't willing to put in in my opinion, not that hard of work to just like think about the problem, because they have this internal fear of failing.
Well, I think another thing can also be that those problems, when it comes to a GP, it's obviously a huge problem, right? You're kind of like, the metagame is just what it is. You can't really anticipate it, you can't expect it. It's such a big field. But when you start to like think about, a bigger trend, like I talk about, if if there's a graveyard deck that's good, or big mana's good. That was something I would write about a lot when it came to my writing on Star City, was looking at trends in the metagame and the kinds of decks people are playing and how you can see people adapting. Breaking it down into more useful chunks is really hard sometimes. Sometimes it's going to be overwhelming to be like, well, I know that a bunch of people are going to be playing these mid-range decks, but I don't know the right way to build my deck to kind of hedge against that. And that's where you can look at it and go, that's where I need to improve. I think when it comes to deck selection, like, especially for these important events where you need to win the thing, keeping your eyes on the big trends of like everything, because that's what everyone is kind of shared information about, right? Everyone knows that Living End or Dredge is winning, right? So then everyone kind of comes together and they all independently decide, well, if Dredge is doing well, I need to make sure I have Graveyard Hate. So then Dredge becomes a bad choice. You can extrapolate to all sorts of things. So people are like, oh, the control decks are really good now. The control decks are the better things, so now everyone's bringing their anti-control cards, their anti-aggro cards in the same vein.
Let's kind of move into how do we go about picking a deck for an event like this, because we're kind of already talking about that, and that's something we really wanted to hit. And you're kind of talking about now, Abe, like breaking down this chunks of information, then figuring it out from there. So, Abe, why don't you start us off? How do you go about doing this sort of thing and going about it? Like, let's say, like my first RCQ, Modern, July 2nd. How would you go about looking at that sort of thing if that was you right now?
I'd look at the format, look at the decks that I want to play, which is kind of influenced by how I feel about the format at large, right? I would probably personally, a little biased because Modern, but I would play Hammer because I feel very comfortable with the deck. I'd pick something that I feel like I can play proficiently, and then I would build my deck to make sure it has answers to things I think would show up. I think if you're starting from a way further back place than me, something that I always try to remember is something that Paul Rietzel said once on Twitter that has really stuck with me, which is, if you're looking for a good deck to be playing in a format as big as Modern, you should look at what all of the decks are trying to do, what the common thread is with them, and then try to do something that does not interact on that axis. Like, figure out what the games are about, and then move your game plan somewhere. It's kind of like why big mana is good against, like Tron is good when 4-color is good, right? People are about the battlefield, the small advantages. Tron is going to invalidate that by being like, I'm going to play a Karn, it's going to be faster than you can deal with, and I'm going to get you. I think about that a lot, looking at where things are, and then thinking about the place that I want to be attacking things from a new angle. And then I'd go from there and work through decks that I enjoy, decks that I think are strong, decks that I think attack the other piece of information in the metagame going on, right? That have favorable matchups and what I expect to be popular.
Struggling at how I was going to tackle this point in the podcast. I think I'm just going to do it from the perspective of what I think the average listener and the average Magic player actually has happen. Because what actually ends up happening, I think, a lot of the time is a player's like, hey, what deck should I pick for this season? And they have a deck that they play. And maybe that deck has access to, like, some pivots, like if you have 4 colors, Elementals is, like, really close and vice versa. But for the most part, they're trying to pick a deck. So I go about it if I was in that position of, like, kind of like what Abe said, like, hey, what's going on? Yada, yada, all that sort of stuff. Echo that. And then where do I want to be if I have to play this deck, let's say 10 times over the course of this 3-month period? Is this a thing I'd be wanting to play? Do I think it has enough game? And do I think it's resilient to, like, changes in the metagame? And I think that sort of stuff is super important. If, like, card availability is a big issue, which I think it just is for a lot of people. And for the newer formats, it's actually a much huger problem because of the pandemic. And then the thing that I think personally that also doesn't apply to that so much is, what deck do I think will give me the highest chance to win? Whether that's true or not, like, it's kind of like we mentioned earlier in the show, the process of going through everything, figuring it out, and then picking the stuff and picking my spots sideboard wise and tech card wise to win this battle. So, like, a good example of this might be, man, I really think the Elementals deck is strong. It has some great stuff going for it. But a lot of the reasons that it is strong is because it dodges a lot of the stuff. It attacks 4 color that's really popular right now, like stuff like Living End. And then you get to play a bunch of endurances. So I think for this weekend, I really like it a lot about 4 color, the Elemental 4 color deck. But I think I don't want to give up access to this counterspell part of my deck. And so instead, I'm going to play some more endurances in my main deck and try and be like Elementals and that sort of thing, and, like, kind of crib their style. And so figuring out where I want to be playing and, like, how I plan for games to end and how I plan for games to play out, I think is a big part of that. Since, what about you?
The first one I've already mentioned is I want to be able to beat aggro decks, especially, like, at the RCQ level. You're just going to run into some number of people. For this, season, if you're listening to this, well, I think this is probably going to be a pretty good evergreen podcast. I think that for this season, Mono Blue Spirits might actually be the deck that I might think about making sure that I have some amount of game against, because it's both the cheapest deck and it's really, really strong. The next thing is I want to be having fun. Like, I personally just don't play good Magic when I'm not having a good time. So I need to enjoy the deck. Next up is I need to have a belief in the matchup spread. I don't need to like know the exact matchup spread, but just have a belief in like how I believe and perceive the matchups to play out, and have a belief in like, okay, I can accept this. When I fill out my character sheet, as Abe said, like, I'm okay with this. Then I would ask myself a question of, is the deck that I'm talking about, is it just the best deck in the format? And does that deck answer all of these questions? Because if it does, then now I need to ask myself, like, why not play that deck? And then there's like a couple other things. One, can it play Scapeshifter Primeval Titan? 2, does it have snakes in it? And if those are options, that could be another ring in that.
Do I get to register Stewie?
Stewie. I think that's going to do it for this week's episode, though. I think the thing to kind of take away from all of this is when you're picking a deck, you should be thinking about why you're picking it, if assuming the goal is to win the tournament. And you should be walking through that process, and you're going to get the process wrong a lot of the time, and you're going to end up in the wrong places. But you just keep doing the process, and you will get better at it, and you will learn things, and you'll slowly improve over time. You might quickly improve, but you just will improve, and you'll get better and better at it. And it comes down a lot to like just making sure you're thinking about things. And when you're thinking about them, are you taking actions that make logical sense and as a response to them that aren't overstepping and being these extreme reactionary things? And so when it comes to picking a deck for the RCQ, think about all that kind of stuff. Try and break it down, like Abe said, into like this logical, this produces information with this. I think they'll do this because of that. And then if you get it wrong for that weekend, that's cool. Run it back. And also, like Spencer mentioned, one last fun important part is just because you won doesn't mean you got it wrong. You might have like a really good deck or have done a lot of the right things, and you just hit the infect player. So, we're ready for your ad nauseum deck. So that's going to be it for the main topic of this week's episode. If you want to support the show, like we mentioned, you go to patreon.com/ccmtg. You get to ask a question like we're asked right now, but also you get to listen to the episodes be streamed live as a patron. We have some people in the chat right now, including where this question came from. And this week's question really geared towards Spencer, something you talked about on the podcast a little bit ago, which was, can you elaborate more on the difference between good quantitative goals and bad quantitative goals? And just in case a listener hadn't listened to that episode, Spencer, can you briefly talk about quantitative goals?
This is in reference to something that I mentioned about what are called objectives and key results, where you create an objective that's qualitative, meaning that you can't measure it, and then you attempt to measure it with quantitative key results. It's meaning that if these things are true, we can then say that we achieved this thing. I think that's a little bit different, for what it's worth, than having quantitative goals. For what it's worth, I don't actually like quantitative goals in Magic. I think they set you up for failure in a game with this much variance. I think we've actually done a podcast on measuring your goals before, and I would actually recommend listening to that episode if you're looking to create goals that are measurable, that are quantitative. What I would suggest is instead create qualitative goals and then decide what your KPIs or whatever you want to call them are, that if you meet a percentage of them, that you can then say, I achieved my goal.
Well, hopefully that was good for you.
Wait, it has a strong opinion of this, so I wanted to answer it too.
You said it very well. I think that, like, when it comes to having good quantitative goals, it's just about tying it to something qualitative where you're like, I want to be a better Magic player, right? Then you need to define what that means to you in this moment. If that's, for me lately, it's been, I need to be honing in on my technical play. I want to make sure I'm not making these avoidable mistakes. I'm thinking things through. I'm taking X amount of time to make decisions. I'm doing things a way that's satisfactory to me, but I define that. And especially if you're going to focus on quantitative goals, make them things that are reasonable and attainable so that they're not so far out there that you're like, I need to play 7 hours of Magic Online a day, or I need to play until I get a 5.0 every day, and that's how I'm going to get better. That is how you ruin your life. It's not a good way to do anything. Yeah. But a quantitative goal, for example, you could say, I want to listen to like 3 podcast episodes a week about Magic specifically, because that's a goal that you have about improving at Magic. The larger qualitative goal, that's a good way to set good quantitative goals, ones that are attainable, reasonable with the rest of your life. They're measurable and achievable, and they're working towards this bigger goal. Because usually places where quantitative goals are good is like, I don't know, if I told myself I wanted to run a mile every day, I would just run until I ran a mile and I'd be done. I'd meet my goal. But usually when it comes to things that are more complicated, those goals are building blocks of building a foundation for a better and more complete goal.
I also want to mention that I might have said them backwards. And I do this for a literal living, and I might have said them backwards still. So if it's confusing for you listening to this, you should definitely look up the difference between quantitative and qualitative. Which is, quantitative means you can quantify it, and qualitative does not mean that.
Quantitative, you can count it. Qualitative, is it good or bad?
You can take this segment over to the YouTube comment question, because we always do that next. This one is more of a comment, but it's okay because it praises me, and that's good. This podcast deserves more attention. I hope you guys get it all. What a cool episode on Game Vision, from Game Vision. Thank you.
Episode 407, Understanding Control Deck. I put the episode in there for a reason.
Wow.
For a reason.
I'm gonna, along this sort of thing, since it's all about praising me, we unfortunately we were supposed to have a guest on this week's episode, and when we got to picking decks for an RCQ, I had this whole bit prepared of like, what's it like just to DM me to get the answer, and I don't get to run that bit. So, unfortunate.
Thanks, you, buddy.
I thought it was really funny because the guy who was coming on definitely just does DM me a lot for a deck list and goes, I 5-0'd with it. I'm locking it in. I'm like, you probably shouldn't do that, but okay.
Also, even if he does, he's just going to change it in like 45 seconds anyway.
Well, that's going to do it for all of that. Make sure to check out the rest of the network. There is Common Knowledge, a Pauper podcast all about that format. Can RCQs be Pauper? I don't actually know the answer to that question. That might be something to look into if you're an LGS owner.
They cannot. They can be standard, pioneer, modern, and
still a Moto Challenge format. 3-3 gets you some E plus EV. That's 50%, baby. That's better than NFTs by a lot. You can also check out Drafting Archetypes. This is a all-limited podcast by Sam Black on the network. What I love about Sam Black's podcast is that it has constant value that doesn't fluctuate with the market, like cryptocurrencies. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment. If you're watching the video version of the podcast, you're having a great time right now. But make sure to leave those sort of things. That is a way to help support the show without having to give money. It means great. Even if your comment's bad, we do like to get feedback, whether it's good or bad, so we can always improve the show. Maybe you're like, wow, I really like it when Mason just daggers for cryptocurrency people. And then maybe you're like, wow, Mason doesn't understand that diamond hands never sell. And with that, I say, Abe, where can someone find you on social media?
They can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. It's where I put all of my thoughts. And also where you can DM me for coaching with the Hammer Time Modern deck.
Given me on Twitter, it's Spencer13H. Hopefully, you will soon be able to find my other podcast, Need to Nerd. We're in conversations of finding a way to bring that back. You can also find me on twitch.tv/EasyMedia to watch me stream Magic or Lego Star Wars. Thinking of doing like a Red Dead stream here, as well as the Constructive Criticism and Easy Media YouTube channels. And hopefully soon, you can find me on Medify for Magic coaching.
Well, if we're all promoting coaching here, I'm promoting mine. At twitter.com for @MasonEClark _ I actually probably still pop up if you just put Mason E. Clark, but on the _1, Papa Musk put me in the doghouse forever. I'm never coming back. I need some clout and some followers. But jokes aside, you can check me out here every week. You can check out my articles at Card Kingdom. And I do offer coaching as well, so reach out. I kind of cover all things. I actually had a session yesterday where I was working with a lady who was wanting to do this exact thing, actually, with help figuring out like a deck to play RCQ season, specifically for like Pioneer, because a lot of Pioneer events coming up, and also kind of wanting to, along that same vein, get more entrenched in the format. And I think we had a really good session with all that, and we're actually doing part 2 of it tomorrow. So if you want to do that, feel free to reach out, and we'll see y'all next week for another episode of Constructed Criticism.